Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie. Good to be with you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Ronnie. We're trying to survive our lack of representation in Canada. Bob is much closer to it than I am, but I think I feel it just as acutely.
That's excellent. When I say excellent, I mean it's excellent because that's the subject for today, Wally, the
Ah,
history of political representation. And it's to me, it's no different in as I'm seeing it in the free world, that there is a real struggle going on to get effective representation. Our politicians are voted in and then essentially insist that they have received a mandate and they will just get on the business of governing. And the tyranny, as it used to be historically, the tyranny of the absolute monarch has now moved to the tyranny of the absolute parliament. And it is completely undoing our history of political representation and political freedoms. So I'm going to actually let you have the floor, Wally, to take us on in this. Wally Kling.
well, that's a challenging subject, but in any case, yes, I think there must be a difference in philosophy that has occurred over time. I think at one time, I mean, tyranny has been something that's run through history, but I think at one time, especially under certain Christian influence, I think that the attitude was that the individual is a very, very important creation and that the individual has to be respected. And I think that we've moved into an era where less and less respect is given to the individual as such. Within our elected bodies, who seem to feel that they have, well, a divine right to dictate to us. And I think it's something we should be very concerned about because I think it's a trend, and I think it's a trend that is going in the wrong direction, and it's extremely dangerous.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent opening salvo, Wally. I'm going to cut across to a document before I give you the floor, Robert, and just a couple of presentations for our audience. And just this weekend, this bloke, Andrew Hastie, I think it is, he's a politician, and he's written in regard to the inordinate power that the president of China is having over his total control and beyond. And of course, this inordinate power is influencing Australia. Now, this particular paper is covering 5 different points of view, but really the same thing. And there is another one I wanted to bring up, and that was in regard to Hewitt of Berry in the ALOR Library, The New Despotism, and then, of course, the passing of Parliament. And every time I go looking for this, I lose it. But it is the passing of Parliament. Keaton, there it is. The passing of Parliament is there. And those 2 books are really, really important because they show that in our democracies, in our elected democratic parliaments, if you like, the power has gone from the House, it's gone to the executive, and then from the executive, if you like, it's gone to the ministers, and now even to the, if you like, the bureaucracy. The power has passed from Parliament, and it is a new despotism, and that's what those 2 books are about. And I'd recommend, if you want to be a student of that particular part of history, then there's a very good starting point. Robert Klinck.
Well, of course, the politicians come into the scene only usually for a limited period, whereas the bureaucracy is permanent and top bureaucrats will stay in their positions, deputy ministers and that sort of thing, for decades. And therefore, they acquire the expertise that allows them to dominate ministers. Somebody getting elected to Parliament doesn't mean they have any particular knowledge of the responsibilities that will be assigned to them. So they're very dependent on this bureaucratic structure. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that politicians run on party platforms, and the party platforms spell out the program they intend to follow if they get elected. Then they get elected, and for some reason, they seem nowadays particularly to be totally disconnected from the policies they were advocating. And they, as you said, Arnie, they get what they call a mandate, and this allows them to do whatever they want. And it's really, power has gone to their heads, and it's a very undesirable situation because it means that they are totally unresponsible to the population.
Mm-hmm.
Once in a while, they'll have some consultative body that goes around. Well, I was told by a leader of the political party in Canada that inquiries and commissions and so on are all designed to cover the truth rather than to get to it, and to make sure that the predetermined policy is followed. It's not a genuine consultation.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly think that is observable in many cases of consultations, alleged consultations of the population.
Mm-hmm. That's a valid observation, Robert. We've recently had a Royal Commission into banking, and if ever the outcome was predetermined and was never going to actually get to the core of the issue of private ownership of banks and private, if you like, personal policy, personal derived benefit from a central banking policy, and it was never going to actually deal with that issue. And I think that is most important. Now I'm just going to cut across to one more website before I bring you up, Wally, and that is this one here, which is the Yale Law School, Lillian Goldman Law Library, the Avalon Project. I came across this morning, and wonderful project. I was able to actually go through the different archives, and the one that got me there in the first place was just looking up the English Bill of Rights, 1689. Most important, our history is most important, because in looking at documents like that, we realise that this struggle is not new. What we're going through is not new. It's actually fought and fought and fought again. Wally Klinck.
Well, it's no small challenge for a society or historically to develop and evolve institutions which are which preserve and honor the idea of genuine representation for the individual by those he chooses to carry out his policies, his or her policies, and so it's been a long, long struggle with all sorts of combinations and permutations along the way. And I think the original British representative or Saxon representative body was called a Witan.
Mm-hmm.
You may remember that term. And of course, then you had the relationship of the nobles toward the king and all that sort of thing, and taxation, and then you had, of course, the statute. And what was it? The original rebellion of the
Peasants' Revolt.
Magna Carta.
The Magna Carta. Is what
Okay, right.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and which was a rebellion of the nobles against the king because they were getting tired of his taxation without representation. And I guess they threatened to behead him if he didn't come to the table and talk seriously about the situation.
That's right.
So anyway, and it's been a long time. I think the church has played quite a very definite role in the whole procedure in Magna Carta itself. I think that the church has provided I guess you would say, a moral guide.
I'd like to interject on that, Wally.
Yeah.
And I'd like to challenge you that the Archbishop Stephen Langton, representing, if you like, truth, pursued that, and he was he contributed significantly to the, if you like, the recording of the ancient rights and freedoms. But the church, I'm going to come back to you, the church annulled Magna Carta within a month. The church annulled it. And so the tyranny can also be exercised in the church, and we've got to be quite clear about that to our listeners, that the tyranny can be just as easily exercised through, if you like, another organised structure
Mhm.
as it can through Parliament. And so, to me, the issue is about bringing power back to the people. It's about decentralising power, and of course, political representation, which is our subject for today. The argument is that the politicians are elected and then they completely ignore the electorate after that. So sorry about that, Wally. I just wanted to clarify because to me it was like a flashing red light that was going off. I'll let you have
Well,
the
this is
floor.
very interesting, Arnie. I understand what you're saying, I believe, but I also think that the Magna Carta was revised a couple of years later, was it not?
It was constantly, it was an argument that lasted from the Great Charter, 1100,
Hmm.
and it was finally written into the common law, 1295, nearly 200 years
Yeah,
later. Yeah. hmm
right.
Mm.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an ongoing
Well,
fight.
that's right. I it's and of course in the modern era, the tremendous power that the financial institutions wield
hmm
with regard to the utilization of the real credit of society has been a decisive factor
hmm
in in allowing society to function
mm
in a functional manner or in a manner that is dictated.
hmm
And that has been a very, very decisive factor.
hmm
You speak of politicians, for instance, believe it or not, it's almost hard to believe, but our current government under the prime ministership of Justin Trudeau has, just prior to the upcoming election, instituted a program of financially assisting the media to the extent of a lot of money. Now, you would think that this would be absolutely unconstitutional, illegal,
hmm
just simply unthinkable.
hmm
He's trying to buy the media
mm
with our money.
mm mm. We've got a
Isn't
system. We've got a system in Australia where each politician in the electoral campaign, every vote that they receive, they get actually after they receive 4% of the vote, then they are given so much per vote after that as part of their campaign fund. So in Australia, the taxpayer actually pays for the campaign. So, so yes, in the end, the taxpayer is paying for the very rope that he's going to be hung with. And if it gets to the stage where the media is supported by the taxpayer, because the internet is moving away from the, if you like, the official media, and they're going to the free media, and the free media being
mm-hmm.
the likes of us, anyone who's on the internet um, presenting a different case. So yes, but it's still the same. The taxpayer will pay for the rope that actually hangs him. It hangs his feet
Yes,
in. Yeah.
that's right. And it seems to be almost unthinkable that they could get away with that. I would think it would be actionable.
Mm, mm. If the laws
I
are
mean,
what I understand now is, of course, is that they pass the laws, it becomes law, and it doesn't matter how insidious it is. The history of laws that are passed, the enclosure acts, which threw people off their land that they'd been there for hundreds of years and generational, they were tied to the land. I mean, it's these things are not new. The wrestle for freedom has been going on for thousands of years, and just because Parliament can pass a law, blue-eyed babies are put to death. Obviously, the tyranny of Parliament is the issue that's on the floor.
well, the problem is too that, of course, it doesn't always all rest with one party. One party can initiate it, but other parties must and probably do see the potential in it for them
hmm
to exercise power too.
hmm
So, on some of these issues that are really critical, you don't get the type of resistance or opposition that you would hope to get from the opposition.
That's a very valid statement, Wally. Previous election we've just had only a couple of months back, the main parties, principal parties, Conservative and Labor, Labor being opposition to Conservative, the Coalition, which was National and Liberal, the Labor and Greens, which are the four big players, all agreed to swap preferences so that they would exclude anyone else from getting in there, any chance of any representation. And they agreed. And it really is treacherous what's going on. The Parliament, the party system has subverted the Parliament, and now they're fighting, openly fighting, against the people. Robert Klinck.
Well, they want to establish a monopoly of power.
Mm-hmm.
The fight between those who would extend freedom and those who would take that freedom away and develop their own control over society is a permanent state of mankind. It's not something that will ever end. It's a battle that must be constantly waged, because as soon as an opportunity to acquire power arises, somebody's going to go in there and fill the vacuum, I guess. So that is so. In Canada, this threat of our losing a free press is very worrying. I don't think we have any kind of constitutional guarantee of a free press. I might be wrong about that, but in any case, the document to which everyone appeals if they think they've got a grievance against the government and have a hope of protection against the government is what we call the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And at the end of that is a provision that says any clause or whatever of this document is subject to the rule of what prevails in a democratic society. Well, I believe that Stalin claimed to have had a democratic society. I think that was in his constitution. So it's just a vague term, and it doesn't offer anybody any protection at all, because the definition will vary according to the ideological bent of the person examining it. So the problem is basically that people need a sanction against the government. And increasingly, the government is holding all the sanctions because it taxes people heavily, and this means that they control the finances that people need in order to survive. And before you acquire an income, you're going to have to submit yourself to policies emanating from government, because government is such a major employer in our societies. So the real issue, the decisive battle in this war for extending the freedom of the individual, is to give the individual more control over the financial system. And this, of course, is the focus of social credit policies. In the past, reformers have come up with all sorts of slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, which is a real mind bender, total cognitive dissonance in that thing. But they don't come down to any concrete measures that would actually give the population some effective device for controlling the politicians. And ultimately, that is going to have to be a decentralization of financial power into the hands of all citizens. And there is a potential for that today because of the progress of productive methods, which means that there's a deficiency of buying power in the hands of the population to liquidate the costs in production and to come into possession of what is being produced. So in order to fill this gap, it would be an elementary matter to distribute dividends to the population. The effect of that would be to make people increasingly independent of government and increasingly capable of exerting their own pressure upon it.
Yeah, no, very good observation there. Thank you for that, Robert. That's right. The national dividend and consumer price discount, which would operate at the retailer in order to ensure there were no inflationary pressures Now, social credit provides monetary realignment, if you like, so placing the economic vote in the hands of the individual. And that to me is most profound and most important. But social credit isn't limited just to the financial question. It also presents a case for a political solution, and that political solution is in the form of a dissenting referenda, if you like, a sanction against. So that I think some people call it citizens' initiative referenda and recall, but in particular, I believe it's the referenda that's a naysayer to disallow bad legislation. And I think that the negative is very, very important to actually be able to pull the parliament back into equilibrium. Wally.
I think you're talking about the negative vote. I believe that's what you're referring to.
Hmm.
It's ultimately integrity is the whole basis of the real credit of society, of the real health of society.
Mm-hmm.
And integrity has at least two aspects. It has the ethical aspect, and it also has the intellectual aspect. If you don't have ethical integrity, there's not much hope, of course, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're so busy just running after the dollar or whatever unit of currency you have in your particular jurisdiction, that you don't have time to really enrich yourself culturally, you're not going to have the understanding or appreciation of integrity. You're just simply not able to devote the time and energy to that is necessary for successful living.
Mm-hmm.
And so that you, as long as you are, a slave to the economic system, and that you're just pounding all the time, trying to survive and meeting debt that is simply getting bigger and bigger in front of you, where you're not getting ahead of it, there's just no chance for a genuinely cultured society. And we've seen at the same time that the state has taken over a major function of education, naturally, and that gives the state a tremendous power of manipulating values and how people see things, so that you have a monopoly of opinion. And that, again, is very dangerous, especially when that monopoly can be maintained by a state of economic servitude, where you don't really have time to think very much about alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
So these things, it's a question of leisure being related to freedom, and freedom being related to the ability to explore and to educate yourself. And without that, you're just a functionary in a mechanism that is run by centralized power. And that is a degradation of the whole concept of humanity.
I agree,
So
Wally.
it's a big problem. And until, as Bob was saying, this aspect of the financial system is really, the financial system is the dynamo, or is the driving force that determines all human activity of a functional kind. And if it has an excessive power, the problem comes basically from the fact that we can't enjoy what we produce until we do something else first, which means that you are really in a position where you don't have choice. You have to do what you are offered, whether it's joining the military or whether it's building a monument to your current dictator or whatever it is, which has nothing to do with genuine human satisfaction, just so that you can get the monetary units to buy something that has been produced in the past.
That's right.
Something you've already achieved physically.
Yeah.
And if you think about that and really think about it hard and fast, you're going to, I'm sure, come to the conclusion that this is a terribly oppressive and dangerous situation. It just means that the quality of society and civilization is just impaired immensely. And because it is a situation that becomes worse as you modernize your economy, because the debt requirement grows, it doesn't improve. The situation actually deteriorates. as you move into future time. So it's a completely, well, you might say hopeless outlook unless we do something
Mm-hmm.
very concrete to reform the financial system so that people can actually draw from the production system at the rate that the production system actually produces goods and services without having to go into debt or to mortgage your future or to be involved in producing things that are useless or even dangerous, like war. War is an absolute, almost inevitable outcome of this situation because the situation depends upon the engagement in activity, which is essentially irrelevant or wasteful and increasingly destructive. It's artificial. It's like people in university dreaming up all sorts of the wildest projects at the public expense because they want to preserve their sinecure and the security they have from the position they have. Doesn't mean that the project has any merit at all, but they expect the public to pay for it. And to me, that again is a perversion of the educational activity, because education should be a genuine search for relevant information. It shouldn't be a manufactory of artificial causes.
That's very well put, Wally, and I appreciate the bringing in the universities and even, if you like, the seminaries in the same thing. That if they hold the seat, they hold the chair, and then we talked about media, but it's exactly the same. The
Well,
universities are an extension of media, and the fact is that the government principal benefactors to the universities. And if they're subsidising media, I might make note, in Australia, the ABC is subsidised to the tune of over $1,000 million Australian per annum in order for it to function. And of course, they are enormously biased, and they certainly are aligned with the universities. And so it is
well,
really pursuing a totalitarian philosophy, both those forms of media. Robert Klinck.
I nearly fell off my chair the other day.
Mm,
I couldn't believe it. There was an announcement that the university has declared that from henceforth, beef products will be prohibited
mm,
on the campus.
mm.
Did you hear me?
I did. I heard that. We heard the news here, and it's just. I mean,
I
that's
mean,
a
they,
philosophical. Yeah.
they're completely out of control. I
Mm,
mean, experts are certainly entitled and expected to come up with different studies and theories and so on and so forth.
hmm.
But the expert is supposed to be on tap and not on top.
That's
And
right.
they're becoming absolutely drunk with power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you imagine somebody telling me when I go to the university confectionery or whatever it is, that I will no longer be able to eat beef? Now, I'm not a big beef eater, but
Mm,
that's not the point.
hmm.
It's whether the individual is free or not to choose his diet.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are getting absolutely to the point of the whole thing is surreal.
Yeah. It is surreal. That's right. They're totalitarian by nature. Robert.
Well, Arnie, we have the same kind of state-controlled um, information services here as well. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It's got the same massive budget.
Hmm.
From the very beginning. It and what they call the National Film Board have been dominated by, I guess you'd say, left-wing thinkers,
I,
people
I,
who are oriented towards socialism.
I
Some of these
would.
people were brought in from England because they had that orientation.
Yeah.
They had to set up the.
I'd just qualify that left wing, Robert, and say totalitarian, I think, is a better word, because totalitarian covers whether it's a fascist or it's a socialist. It doesn't matter. They're all totalitarian. Anyway, keep going.
Well, I agree with you, Arnie. It's
Yeah.
this terminology is tricky because it can lead to offense where none is intended,
Hmm.
and it can alienate. It's this business of having the dialectic work in society again. You
Hmm.
got the right wing against the left wing,
Hmm.
and it never ends, and people can't get together to agree on a common interest that they
Hmm.
can all promote.
Hmm.
But what was I going to say? The Yeah, well, we're offered sloganeering rather than coming together, uh, agreeing that the financial system, rather than being a system of coercion upon the individual, which it certainly is today because of the program of full employment,
Mm-hmm.
which requires people to have a job in order to have an income,
Mm-hmm.
which, although people don't think of it very in that way, is exactly the opposite of freedom. We have to decide, get a clear vision of whether we want to accept the current situation where the financial system is a basis of control and coercion, or whether the financial system should serve the interests of release of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a matter of altering the processes whereby income is distributed to the population, and you can change that the situation we have today of coercion in a radical way and make it serve personal freedom rather than oppression.
Thank you for that, Robert. Beautifully summarised. Wally, Klinck, closing
Oh,
comments,
yeah.
please.
And make no mistake about it. The financial system pits everyone in society against everyone else
Mm-hmm.
because there's a shortage of money, which is demonstrated by the enormous debts which we've had to incur. It's absolute proof that there is a shortage of purchasing power.
Mm-hmm.
And when people are short and feel tight in their situation, they will be driven into not constructive relationships with each other, but it goes beyond that. They will be driven into destructive relationships where they're trying to derive from the other party more than they really should be if they were, associating freely for mutual advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the dialectic. And, in Marxism, the dialectic is the thesis and antithesis, which are two opposing factions which lead to further developments, the thesis,
Mm-hmm.
synthesis. And yes, and so you can see that it is a source of conflict, and that is very dysfunctional in terms of human relationships. It's absolutely damaging to the whole fabric of society.
Yeah, I might mention, Arnie, you were talking about the popular referendum as a way of controlling government policy.
Voters veto. Yeah, I
The
think it's
voters
referred.
veto.
Yeah, just to stop bad legislation, Robert.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very uncommon, but it was actually introduced by a nominal social credit government in British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
When the premier was a fellow named Bill Vander Zalm, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and they have it's if you get a petition with a sufficient number of signatures on it,
Mm-hmm.
you can impose a referendum on an item of governmental policy.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually did this at least on one occasion
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of assistance from Bill Vander Zalm because he was very concerned about it. And they got a taxation scheme reversed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's used very seldom, but it can be a very effective device. And it places the popular will effectively over the will of the politicians who are elected and think they can get away with anything.
Yeah. No, that's a very good summary, Robert. A very good summary, and you too, Wally. The voters' veto, essentially a method of calling to order bad legislation, bad politicians, or bad bureaucrats. Very, very important. And this business of voting, financial voting, Douglas referred to it as economic democracy. By placing sufficient spending power in the hands of the individual, that the costs of production could be liquidated, so that debt could be a thing of the past, and that the individual would be independent. They would be able to receive their inheritance, their cultural inheritance, the wages, if you like, of the machines, of automation, of advanced control, of all these vast quarries of resources. And of course, the benefit is there to be had, but it's something that has to be pursued. It won't come unless sufficient energy, sufficient belief that that is there to be had. And of course, political representation is never going to allow it, while the tyranny of Parliament is continuing, and so it has to come back to the individual in association working for freedoms. Wally Klinck and Robert Klinck, thank you so much for today's forum. It's been a beaut.
Well, thank
Thank
you,
you.
Arnie. Good to be with you and to try and contribute.
Good work. No worries. Cheers, ladies and gentlemen.